Welcome to our study of Treasury of Precious Qualities by the Omniscient Jigme Lingpa with the commentary by Kangyur Rinpoche, Longchen Yeshe Dorje. So as always, please generate the awareness of suffering and the intention to alleviate suffering through the practice of the path. The practice of the path is to eliminate the confusion that causes suffering universally. And we eliminate this cause of suffering through generating the wisdom that sees through what is fundamentally a cognitive dysfunction. The delusion of samsara is created by an absence of awareness, by a condition of essentially misunderstanding reality, but that originally takes place on the basis of simply a moment of unawareness, inattentiveness, and on the basis of that, all the various hallucinations that take place, which we then refer to as samsara, they originate just like someone who is caught in a dream without being aware that they are in a dream. So we're presently practicing the path in order to generate the wisdom that sees through this delusional condition. So we do this with the intention to alleviate suffering for ourselves, but also for all sentient beings. We understand that this is what afflicts sentient beings everywhere. So understanding the innocent condition, or rather the innocent nature of all sentient beings, and yet them finding themselves in this continual condition of suffering, which they themselves are generating through their confusion. So that's where we're engaging in this study presently, really as part of this whole process that we want to become a little bit wiser, and with a little bit of more wisdom also being less caught up in the delusion that essentially drives a perception of solid self, solid other, what we call duality. And within this, you could say, condition of misunderstanding reality, solidifying our sense of me and solidifying the sense of other, we're continually creating this condition of suffering. So we want to get to the bottom of that, and we do this really with the awareness that this is what happens to all of us. So that sort of fundamental sympathy for the condition that we're all sharing, this is where we're then engaging in this particular study. So that's where we begin. This essentially we call this preparing with bodhicitta. And so we are presently then in the chapter on, well, this book actually, let's just go over the list of contents because it's very interesting. And there's different ways of getting at the material, but it's always quite helpful to appreciate the ways that the teachings are presented, really from the point of view of beginning to be more, we'd say, have a sense of the richness and also universality of what we're studying here. So this book here, that works on the basis of turning the mind to the Dharma, and that's where we looked at first the extraordinary condition of being born a human. So that's where we kind of have this positive inspiration that right now something amazing has taken place. We've won the lottery, and that's where we want to invest this incredible fortune in a good way. The second is then understanding that right now, while we have this incredible fortune, it's not going to last. So that's why we meditate on impermanence. And then third is the gradual path for the three kinds of beings. And that's where we understand the spiritual path can be approached in terms of just wanting to be happy, Fair enough. But that's still going to be a situation in which eventually the causes for happiness runs out. So it's not really going to be the ultimate solution, but that is very often how we approach spirituality. Fair enough. That's where we then talk about the lesser scope. Then there are those who understand really how the condition of confusion drives suffering. And so that's where we want to get to the bottom of confusion. That's the medium. And then there's the greater, which is understanding then how all beings really are subject to this. And this is the greater capacity of the greater scope. So in this way, there's different ways to approach. One is, you could say, a rather superficial and also rather self-centered one, just wanting to have a better place. The second one is more intelligent, but still centered on the self, and that is just wanting freedom for oneself. And finally, there is this again, much greater awareness of the suffering of all beings universally. And so that's where we have the third kind. Now, presently then, within these three kinds of beings, we're looking at the path of the beings of the lesser scope. And that's essentially where we talk about ethics. That's where we looked at karma, what will essentially drive, what drives suffering and what drives happiness. And the awareness of that, of course, then brings us to acting in ways that will be happier. So ethics, universally actually, not just in Buddhism obviously, but and not only in spirituality, but even within an ordinary human context. We want to act ethically simply out of respect for ourselves and also out of respect for the, you could say, these community that we are situated within. And then there's the beings of the medium scope, and that's where we're presently looking at the understanding of the four truths. This is where we're really understanding this, getting to the bottom of things. And then when we talk about the four truths, we talk about the truth of suffering. And that's essentially where we've been looking at the whole condition of samsara, what we call the cycle of existence is this suffering condition in which this delusion of self constantly, by its very nature, drives dissatisfaction, because we're always operating with the sense of me. We're failing to see our ground, which is open, free, luminous, without any center, and rather we retract into a place of confused self-consciousness. And that's where we're always going to be struggling with what we get and what we don't get. So that's where we've looked at the various realms of samsara. We've looked at first the truth of, when we talk about the suffering of samsara, Kangyur Rinpoche presents this, Jigme Lingpa presents this in terms of the Four Noble Truths, which is the truth of suffering, the truth of its origin, the truth of, that it can be removed, the cessation, the good news that's implicit in what we have in the Buddhist teaching, namely that this suffering that we have is a curable condition. And that's where we then look to the path. So here it's going to be a little bit, the last two will be inverse. We first talk about the path and then the cessation that it leads to. But presently we've gone through some details, and I'd like to congratulate you all for hanging in there. Some of it very explicit with regards to how we can get involved, how suffering happens. And this is, of course, like also if we want to be present in the real world, we can't avoid acknowledging that there's war happening in the Ukraine. We can't avoid knowing that there's starvation, suffering, and so forth all over in our world, and also beyond our world, within the world of the animals and so forth. There's tremendous suffering happening universally. We cannot just sort of bury our head in the sand and pretend that it's not happening. So that's where the teachings here, they're not particularly easygoing, but then again, many of us, we're willing to sit through the news at night and actually look at all sorts of horrible news. And so we can't exactly, you could say, avoid this fact. But the good news here is that we can do something about it. So that's where we're going to be looking at the cause. Last time we ended on, we've done various realms of samsara, what we call the higher and the lower realms. And we also particularly then, the last we looked at was the condition of human beings. And I actually said something that was not entirely accurate. There was what we call the, let's see here, the 8 complementary sufferings. And for some reason, I was thinking of 8 conditions that can be unfavorable when we have a precious human rebirth. And this is spoken about by Longchen Ba, and Jigme Lingpa also speaks about it in the context of the Longchen Yingtik. But this actually is not related to that. This is simply the well-known 4 great waves of suffering, which are birth, old age, illness, and death. And then meeting unwanted circumstances, separation from what is loved, and not having what one wants, and having what one does not want. So, so we've covered these. Let's just see here. The first one, meeting unwanted circumstances, is simply when everything goes wrong. The second is separation from what is loved, and that is something that you could say is an incredibly powerful theme within our human realm and within our, you say, lived experience. That many of us are very connected to those to whom we have a very strong and warm, loving relationship, families and so forth. And that's where there's so much suffering associated with losing those that we love or being separated from them. Not having what one wants is this effort that we all try to get this suffering from this poverty of wanting something, that we're sort of continually suffering from just not having enough. And similarly, also, then we see how beings, they are striving on the fear of having what one does not want. Then again, similarly, also striving to just keep at bay what is unwanted. So we have these essentially painful conditions within the 6 realms. And presently, then, we're going to look at the truth of origin. Where does this all come from? So Jigme Lingpa, in the root verses, he then says, let me just say here, 42 and 43. So here we're going to talk about the 5 skandhas. Now, the very cause of suffering is essentially, like I started off saying, the delusion of self. But this delusion of self, it essentially operates with a perception of body, a perception on the basis of the body, a sense of what we like, don't like, and then the ways that we conceptualize. We create narratives around that, which we then call concepts or perception. And this then drives conditioning factors in the sense of the actions that we do on that basis. And all of this is held together with a general sense of just a not exactly awareness, but an intelligence that we call consciousness, which essentially holds the whole sense of our experience as an entity, as a being. It's that overall sense of me. But all this comes together on you could say, the development of first a sense of body, and then on that basis, form and feeling, what we call simply we have on the basis of the body, then there's feeling what we like and don't like. On the basis of that, then the perceptions and stories that we then generate, the conditioning factors, the impulses, and then finally consciousness. These 5, they are what constitute the sense of self, and this is very much what we call the origin. So with these 2 verses here, Jigme Lingpa says, feeling knows the nature of the form on which it's based. Perception is conducive, usually, to action. Conditioning factors multiplies the seeds of future pain, while consciousness appropriates the sense of sorrow. The 5 aggregates are thus the source, the basis and receptacle of every ill, both cause and fruit, the owner and the experiencer of pain. Wherefore I pray you, cast away your sorrow's wellspring, karma, and defilements. Now this is big. If we could just hold that, because we so often engage in some rather naive discussions about, who to blame for the problems in the world. And yes, we can blame it on the men in black or whatever. But at the end of the day, this is really it. So if we want to talk superficial, then of course we can point fingers at the politicians, we can point fingers at the people that bother us, and we're always missing the point, because these people that we're pointing at our fingers at, they're themselves subject to confusion. And so the circumstances that we are attributing as the causes of suffering are really just the superficial circumstances. So if we want to go deep, then we're going to have to say it like this. Of course, if we're sitting in the pub or if we're sitting with friends, then possibly the idea of the fundamental delusion of self might not really might not make sense to people who are not really, you could say, educated in the sense of analyzing the causes of suffering in a really deep way, the way we're doing in the Dharma, in the way the Buddha taught. So that's where this obviously is something we should keep to ourselves, but also it's very often it can be helpful to provide a wider perspective when somebody points their finger at someone, to actually also, us from our awareness say, well, that person in themselves are also very confused and they might not know what they're doing. Might not always, maybe it is not called upon to volunteer such wider perspective. If it's a general sort of party where everybody's just sort of, yeah, we don't like these people, or we don't like this, or whatever, then it might not be called upon. You might end up drinking on your own down at the pub if you sort of provide too much complexity to the discussion. But at the same time, if you really do want to honestly get to the bottom of what drives suffering universally, then Jigme Lingpa is saying something that everyone has been, you can say, recognizing since the time of the Buddha, and that is this delusion of self, which the Buddha very accurately identified as essentially what we call the 5 skandhas. So this is very important. Once there's the delusion of self, then there is the whole cycle of liking and disliking. Once there's me, then it's what I want and I don't want. And it's actually where we become very fussy individuals. And that's where we can see the huge difference between sages and ordinary persons. Sages, they cope. They're very open actually to the nature of reality. Us with less wisdom, less willing to be open to reality. We're very difficult customers actually. And that's where we have likes and dislikes that generate all the various politics of our mind. The toxic politics of our mind are what we call kleshas, the defiled emotions. And that's where we then act on the basis of self and deepen the sense of self on the basis of the kleshas. And we also deepen it further when we act and create patterns, which is then what we call karma. So on the basis of this delusion of the self that's, you could say, imputed on what we call the 5 skandhas, related to the 5 skandhas, constituted through the 5 skandhas, we then have two, you could say, two aspects, two dynamics that emerge from this, which are then what we call kleshas and karma, the toxic mind and its particular likes and dislikes, its various mental attitudes, and then the actions that go with that, which are then karma. So that's why we would say samsara is generated through karma and defilements, or karma and kleshas. And that's where we understand that in turn comes from the 5 skandhas. So right here, we are getting to the bottom really of what drives suffering. So that is the theme also. In terms of the the Four Noble Truths, we first identify suffering, and that's again due to the greatness that comes from a science that does not exclude experience. If you have a science that's only about the material, yes, you'll know a lot about the material, and we have a very sophisticated material science. But if you include experience, then you realize that all of what we go through is, in fact, experience. Everything that we go through is what we can verify is lived through the subjective dimension. So that's a complete science that then takes into account this subjective dimension. That's a greater science. And that's where we then understand these two phenomenologies, or these two realms of experience. One is the enlightened one, of the awakened one, that are no longer confused, and those that are confused. And that's where we go through, then we have very accurate descriptions of these realms of confusion when we speak about, or when the Buddha speaks about samsara. This is not just sort of confusion from the point of view of somebody who's sort of got a partial idea of what the world is like, but someone who has a deep insight into how confusion plays out universally for all beings. So that's where there's a much greater, we could say, epistemic capacity, a much greater understanding on the basis of this understanding of the cognitive dimension. So that's where the insights of the Buddha is not something that we should think is some sort of cultural construct or belief or whatever, but very much appreciate the capacity for someone who's no longer confused to assess what the conditions of awakening are like and what the conditions of not awakening are like. Just like you'd say a doctor is someone who appreciates and works for everybody to essentially have good health, but also is aware of and has studied in great detail all the various aspects of, just illness. So presently then, having familiarized ourselves with the various forms of illness, then we're looking at the very cause. And that's where we're not saying the cause is something out there or just that you're doomed to suffer, but it's on the basis of this delusion of the basic delusion that drives the idea of the skandhas. So the skandhas, again, they're referred to as the aggregates here, aggregations, meaning they're simply just piles, heaps. And so these heaps together, this is actually a heap, right? This is a heap of different things, my watch. It's just things that have come together, and I give it the label watch, but there's nothing in and of themselves that really is a watch. I mean, relatively speaking, for sure, it functions as a watch, but really it's just an aggregation of things put together very intelligently, very effectively, very convincingly, and of course, this is for all practical purposes a watch, but it is something that is aggregated, it's put together, and we are no different. The problem is that we attribute a solidity to this aggregation. So that's where we're now looking at this, essentially what constitutes our sense of me. And that's very, very important for us if we're going to be penetrating the whole idea of self. It's not like I'm going to keep chanting mantras for the next eon, and then hopefully something will happen, or this sense of me will go away. Or actually, we could intelligently say, hey, when I act selflessly, I'm much happier. That's a very important observation. And that, of course, is universally understood. Not of course, but it is, because they're one of the great secrets of the universe then, and it's an open secret. Yes, when we act selflessly, we're much happier. But why? Well, the thing is, actually, the whole drama around self is a hoax. It's a delusional condition, and that's what the Buddha wants us to understand, to not fall for it. So that's why it's important at this point to establish the lack of self. So with regards to then what we call self, we begin generally, we could say, with a sense of body. So this is where we're speaking about the form aggregate. So Kangyur Rinpoche says the form aggregate, the first skandha, is devoid of true existence. Yet it is apprehended perceived as a body and clung to as real. This is the basis for the experience or feeling of pain, whereby the body is known in its true nature. So on the basis of the body, then we have what we can experience: pleasure, we can experience pain. This is the nature of the second skandha, feeling. It's not terribly sophisticated. It's really just basically where we sort of have that binary reaction, like, dislike. So in a way, that's where our vulnerability then, you could say, originates. Now, so then the third skandha, perception. Perception cognizes the unwantedness of suffering. There arises the desire to get rid of it. So that's where we begin to have this intelligence that understands our reality around us, and we begin to have attitudes about what is good and what is bad. That's what we call perception. There arises the desire to be rid of it, and one is thus caught up in action. That's where we begin to then act. And that's where then the fourth skandha, conditioning factors, which is where we begin then to have particular attitudes and act in particular ways. These multiply the seeds or causes of later suffering. So that's where the fourth skandha then generates, on the basis of, you could say, actions such as anger. I don't want this. Then we put down the seed of dislike, and basically, you could say, alienation and struggle. That becomes part of us. Or I really want this, and that again lays down the seed of wanting, neediness, and so forth. So finally, consciousness appropriates the pain as the pain of a self, and the thought arises, I am suffering. And that's where consciousness is the initial, or the sort of, it comes together with the first skandha, the fundamental ignorance. But it's then consciousness that appropriates the experience of the skandhas in what we call the seventh consciousness, which is the afflicted consciousness, as well as all the perceptions that we have with the five senses, as well as thought. So these are the first six consciousnesses. The bottom line is that consciousness overall wraps the whole experience up into the sense of me, and all about me, no less. That's really where you could say it encapsulates the whole experience of identity. And that's where we have this thought, like Kangyur Rinpoche says, I am suffering. These five aggregates, concomitant with ignorance, yeah, these go together. You have the aggregates, and you have this ignorance that attributes solidity, or rather identifies with a solid self, with these conditions of form, feeling, perception, conditioning factors, and consciousness. In fact, the moment that we go through all of these, we can see there is no self, because it's constructed of, we are many different things, and yet for some reason, it's like, somebody explain me why. Why do we identify a self with this, when there is no, when we can see it's constructed by many different aspects, body, mind, different aspects of mind, and so forth. We can see that there's nothing constant, permanent, unitary, or unchanging about this. This is where you could say the crux of samsara lies. This is where our homework lies. Everything we do on the path, everything in terms of meditating, becoming wiser, kinder, engaging pure perception, and so on, practicing the yoga of mantra and what have you, all of that is entirely just about getting to the bottom of this exact point. So that's where this is something that we want to be familiar with. So the five aggregates, concomitant with ignorance, are the source and basis of all pain. Okay? As Khenpo Yunga, he says, Yun Gyatso, as long as the 5 aggregates persist, the continuity of suffering is not broken. So what we're doing is attributing solidity to what in fact is just made up of many different things. So just like when we have a mala, then we can see there is a mala, but in fact it's made up of, we're attributing, you could say, a single name to something that in fact is a lot of, is in fact something that doesn't possess the continuity that we attribute it as having. So we're mistaken. So Kangyur Rinpoche says, they are the vessel, meaning the five skandhas, they are the vessel in which suffering occurs, for they contain its seed and ripen fruit. They are the cause of future aggregates, the effect of past aggregates, and the present experience of suffering. So this way of constituting self is what has taken place in the past, and the way that we have engaged with this situation in the past that has constructed who we are now, and who we are now will construct who we are in the future. So Kangyur Rinpoche says it's important to understand that this is what they are, and thus grow weary of our situation, giving up negative actions and defiled emotions, the sources of samsaric misery. As long as we're convinced that we are the most important, singular, unitary sort of entity and the center of the universe, which, I mean, this doesn't, maybe we think, oh no, I'm not like that. I'm a very nice person. I help people and I pay taxes and I care for and I love and so forth my fellow human beings. But that's all, that's nice. But unfortunately, why are we even saying that in the first place? That's because we'd like to present ourselves in a particular way. Somebody says, you selfish creep, and we'd like to prove them wrong. You know, I'm not selfish. I'm a very, helpful, nice person. We can see we have to actually humbly acknowledge that there is a condition of self, and that's where we need to begin. And this is so important. If we engage in the spiritual path without really, if this remains a blind spot, we can be involved in the spiritual path for a very long time, and all the spiritual path will do is really just perpetuate this sense of me. It will just become a spiritual ego, spiritual materialism. And that's where we need to have this weariness, that really understand where the delusion lies, and having had enough of it, we then engage in the path. Now, to put an end to the sources of samsaric misery, this is, Kangyur Rinpoche says, this is to be done through the eradication of all ego clinging. So that's comes down to that. So it's simple enough to say ego, but it's really important for us to understand how ego has never come into existence, how ego is a delusion, and to then make that insight, you could say, our own. And that's why we don't blame ego, because ego actually doesn't exist, but we're aware of how delusion constructs ego. And this is on the basis of the 5 skandhas then. So now the truth of the path and truth of cessation. Okay, let's see if there's someone with a question. Unfortunately, I feel like it's quite difficult to get to the point where I can say enough is enough. That is so good, and thank you for saying that, because yes, and that's where you could say we are so conditioned by our delusion for such a long time. So this is where, as much as we very often sort of think, I don't want to study, I just want to meditate. It's unless we actually study, we don't actually really get it. And once we combine this study with meditation, then meditation enables us to be familiar with what's happening inside ourselves. And then again, that enables us to truly understand what is being spoken about here. So to combine these two, the wisdom of study and the wisdom of meditation is so essential, because we have habitual patterns and we're surrounded by a whole, you'd say, civilization, a whole culture, a whole praxis of acknowledging self as just a given. Yeah, you're selfish, that's, the selfish gene, Everybody's selfish in this world, You got to get ahead, You got to push and bully and shove and whatnot. So that's where we can't hear this often enough. And that's where it's so important that we early on that we have this angle of prajna that analyzes our assumptions, that we are willing to question. Many of us, we've grown up in a democratic society where we question authority, right? We question our leaders. We look in, is there deception happening, right? Is there corruption in the government? Is there some sort of, how do you say, dishonesty happening? And that's where we actually need to apply this to ourselves and understand how does this take place within ourselves. Yeah? So this is where we need to do some uncovering of deception that's been going on for a very long time. How this delusion is how we feed it. We feed it through karma and kleshas. So that was Jigme Lingpa's point. We feed it through our basically what we call the 5 kleshas, which is first of all ignorance, the basic unawareness, and then on the basis of that, attachment and aversion, pride and jealousy. So we need to look into ourselves and say, do I have anger? Do I have desire? Do I have pride? Do I have jealousy? That's what feeds this delusion. That's what feeds the unawareness, the unconsciousness. And we can see it gets even worse when we act with anger, when we act with desire or ambition or greed, when we act with jealousy and pride. This ingrains itself in our consciousness. And that's where this delusion is fed. How do we balance the need to value and look after our precious life that we have with the need to subdue ego totally, to be selfless with no self or sense of self? It's very important that we never think that that we have an enemy. Ego is not an enemy because ego doesn't exist. Please make note of this. And this is also what Kangyur Rinpoche is saying. The aggregates have no inherent existence. There is no ego. There's a delusion of ego. So we actually don't need to subdue the self, but we need to have awareness. So that's where we need to understand where the self comes from. And we can see it comes from unawareness. It comes from just not being properly present, not looking properly. And right now, we have an extraordinary opportunity to do that thanks to this human rebirth. So we should really look after this human rebirth. So we need to eat well, just like if you have somebody you want to keep alive who you really care for. We're not talking about indulging the self necessarily, but really keeping this person alive. Not out of the ordinary habitual, you could say, motivation, but really from understanding how important this human condition is. So we need to look after it, wash it, clean it, make sure it gets the checkups it needs, that it's looked after. Do we break identification with the delusion of ego by identifying with something else as a substitute? Do we identify with awareness or seek to dismantle the process of identification itself? We begin with dismantling the process of identification itself. Once we have done that, and we begin to have some sense of where this confusion takes place and where lack of confusion can take place, we begin to have sort of a wider perspective that we can refer to as awareness. And that's where we can begin to sort of relax a bit into awareness. We discover a space where there's less insecurity, there's less toxicity. But that needs to it needs to be preceded by a sort of a hard look, hard stare which is what we're doing here, sort of dismantling, deconstruction of the self. Yeah, that's the first thing we do. But of course, we're all doing this on the premise that we have Buddha nature, that there is a goodness, basic goodness that we can connect with. That's also why, for example, if you do Shambhala training, and in general, if you're in Buddhist culture, you'll see that people are well groomed. They dress well, they eat well, they speak properly. There's a cheerful component of celebrating life, because that's where there's, you could say, an awareness that is not necessarily caught by aggression. With aggression and desire, we become sloppy. We're at odds with the world. We're miserable. We begin to, like, some prophecies from the past says, when things get really, at the end of, when things are getting not so good, people like to dress sloppily, They dress sloppily, they don't look after themselves. So we should, and this is where we can see in a pragmatic sense, the lived experience of egolessness is very much one of cheerfulness, engagement, wholeheartedness in the world. It's an important point. So we should never think these two are in conflict. But it's very important that as we're looking at this from a analytical, being very sort of precise in understanding what exactly, where does suffering come from? We need to dismantle this hoax. We need to disarm this rogue regime. And then we can install, you could say, then we can celebrate and install sanity, as the ruler. So would you please share your view about my first teacher saying we need to have a healthy sense of self before we can dissolve the delusion of self? Well, that's it. So healthy sense of self is then this, you could say, essentially healthy sense of self is selflessness. It's shunyata, it's emptiness. It's that space which is free from the insecurity of self. So you could say the Buddha has a healthy sense of self. But that comes from this intelligence that sees how the ordinary patterns of delusion, they're so they deceive us. So that's where we need to sort of, it's in a way, it's not like a big revolution really. It's just to say, hey, it is interesting that I take myself so seriously. In fact, where is this self? And that's where this analytical component is quite good. So so it's really never a question of us being bad, but very much a sense of innocence. And so even within the confused condition, you could say that even within the ordinary just innocence of the samsaric condition, nobody's really a bad person. It's just that there's a confusion that rules us. Okay. The truth of the path and truth of cessation. Now, this is, by the way, it's going to get big, people. We're going to be looking at dependent origination. It's a big theme, actually. Anyway, we've so far identified how the cause of suffering. Now we're going to look at what to do about it. Now, so the path of those rejecting them, the beings of the middle scope, consists in driving in the chariot of the four truths. They actualize cessation, reaching supreme freedom, the state that lies beyond all suffering. So those that reject, and here we're referring to the delusion of self, as well as the practices of the defilements and karma. And these are the beings of the middle scope. These are the ones who are going to get to the bottom of what drives suffering. We're not yet talking about those who are determined to free all sentient beings. We're just still at the middle scope, but this is then those who essentially eliminate the cause of samsara. So these are sages. they still belong to what we call the Hinayana, those that are only concerned with their own liberation. But anyway, these, and that's universal all across the board in the Buddhist teaching, they drive the chariot of the Four Truths, understanding the place of where suffering comes from and that it can be removed, and hence they engage to proceed towards the healing or the remedying this situation. And such them driving in that chariot there, they actualize cessation, nirvana or enlightenment, reaching supreme freedom. We're talking about big freedom here, but we're actually not talking about perfect enlightenment yet when we talk about those in the middle scope. But still, they actualize cessation. And that is the state that is beyond all suffering. So there's nothing not to like about that. The only, you could say, snag in this is that it's really just for oneself. But that's already something. This is already going to be a big inspiration. So let's see here. The Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, those who ride in the chariot of the Four Truths, are beings of medium scope. They have rejected the ignorance of clinging to I and mine, which is the root and origin of suffering. Okay, let's see what they say about that. The Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, now this is what we call Hinayana, know that all existence, the universe and creatures, are like the shimmering of a mirage, a flash of lightning, the fiery path of a torch whirled in the air. They are constantly fluctuating, evanescent, and painful by their nature. Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas understand also that these very sufferings are unaccompanied by a self, and therefore eradicate the ignorance of wrongly conceiving otherwise. They sever the stream of karma and emotion and reach a state that is beyond all suffering, inwardly relying on the wisdom that realizes no self, which is itself the truth of the path. The Shulika, the letter to a friend by Nagarjuna, says, oh yeah? Okay, hold on. The Shulika says, birth is suffering, and the cause of this is craving. The abolition of this cause is freedom or cessation, gained by following the Eightfold Noble Path. All right? So again, this is such an important point because we're not saying we're just doomed to suffer or that it's imposed on us. It's due to this condition of craving. Though our particular situation, the way that we're born into this world, comes from us on the basis of our ignorance to be caught in essentially what we'll look at now, which is called the chain of dependent arising, but the preceding cause is then what we call craving. So putting an end to that is then what we do with the practicing of the Noble Eightfold Path. Essentially putting an end to our limitation, putting an end to us being stuck in a very narrow place. And that's where we perpetuating, when we talk about birth and putting an end to birth, we're not putting an end to, you could say, life. We're beginning life. We're setting life free. It's where we're putting an end to that which prevents us from being properly alive, if you like. So that's where the Noble Eightfold Path is a remedy. So again, I think we're still quoting Khenpo Yönten Gyatso, in the same way that people riding in a chariot progress to their destination by recognizing, meaning suffering, discarding, meaning its origins, realizing, meaning its cessation, and implementing the path. Practitioners practice and gradually progress through the 5 paths of the Hinayana. Now, what we mean with the 5 paths of the Hinayana, they are in names similar to those of the Mahayana, and they are then the path of accumulation, the path of joining, the path of seeing, the path of meditation, and the path of no more learning. So this way of proceeding occurs also in the Mahayana, and it's vital to understand it. This is what we call the 5 paths. Sometimes we talk about the entire path in terms of, for example, the 5 paths, 10 bhumis, and so on. And when you come into the Vajrayana, then they have other terms for these. You can say the path, like the for Vijayadhara levels and what have you. But essentially, the entire Buddhist teaching operates with this notion that you can cure yourself, you can heal, you can extract yourself on the basis of insight into the causation of suffering and how to undo it. So then it says here, Vasubandhu advises us to bind our minds with the vows of pratimoksha, the monastic ordination, to hear and study the general instructions and the special teaching on no self. And that's what we're doing here, to listen to these teachings, understanding them, and to meditate on this until deep conviction is attained. This is where we need these conditions. The first has to do with lifestyle. So there we can be. Pratimoksha doesn't necessarily only mean the monastics. There's also pratimoksha vows for the lay people. But it essentially implies that we have discipline, that there's a style of lifestyle that is conducive to the path. Then we need to hear and study the general instructions. And that's why it's very difficult to hear and practice the general instructions if we have a lifestyle that's not conducive. So we have to have lifestyle as the sort of building. And on that, then we can engage then in the study. And that's where we can do general teachings, and particularly then what we're looking at here, the teachings on no self, and then meditate until a deep conviction is attained. And again, to start meditating without really having understood the special teachings on no self and without having a particular lifestyle, then again, meditation, we might sort of have a technique of some sort or another, but we can, without the proper foundations, it won't really take us into this place of a deep conviction. So this is where we understand the path is really based on creating the right conditions. So it says, to this end, we should destroy the 20 wrong views associated with identifying with the perishable aggregates as the I, pondering well the sense of Nagarjuna Shulika. So that's where, in conjunction with the 5 skandhas, we have various ways that we can identify or understand the 5 skandhas. It says here, form is not the I, the Lord has said, and I is not possessed of form. Within the I, the form does not inhere, and the form is not the dwelling place of I. The other aggregates, please understand, are likewise void. So when we say we have the body, would we say the body is the I? No, we won't, because if that case, then the I would still be there when the mind was no longer there. Then the corpse would also be the I, so that the form itself is not the I. So the I is not, again, possessed in terms of the form. So that's where we can say there's the sense of self is not something that is defined by the body. And so in the way that the relationship between the self and the experience of the first aggregate of form, the relationship between this is understood in 4 different ways in which this relationship is established. I'm going to get back to this just because there's this here slightly sort of not that easy to get at, and I'll try to find a few places where this is actually quite clearly explained. And that's where we can understand then that the relationship between the I and the skandhas is again delusional. So when we can identify how this self doesn't really, like it says here, inhere to the skandha of form, we can also see how I doesn't inhere to the other skandhas. So that's where we end up having 4 ways in which we can understand the individual skandhas are not the self. And so that's where it ends up becoming what we call the 20 wrong views. And we need to then have some idea in which we can say this self is not the same as the body or the mind and the various aspects of the mind. So it says here, firmly convinced of this, the Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas follow the Eightfold Noble Path. So that's where those that then understand no self, and this is established in various ways in terms of, both in terms of the in terms of space, in terms of time, and so on, they then proceed with an understanding of what it is that needs to be realized. So that's where then it says here, this comprises, so this is the Noble Eightfold Path, this comprises right view, a stainless wisdom, free from the afflictions. So this is where we need to have an insight. This is something that when we talk about right view, this is, of course, something that we don't have right away, but we need to arrive at that through both practice and analysis. And then once we have that, then we can engage this through both our meditation and also our particular ways of acting, our ordinary life. Right livelihood, the abandonment of all evil ways of making a living. Right effort, the 4 genuine restraints. Right mindfulness, which is not to forget the object of concentration and its accompanying attitudes. In other words, the 4 close mindfulnesses. Right concentration, the 4 samadhis and so forth, the foundation of the noble path. Right speech, the 4 positive verbal actions. Right conduct, the repudiation of the 3 negative actions of the body. Right thought, virtuous states of mind such as benevolence. The attainment of liberation depends exclusively upon one's own efforts. In Shulika, the Nagarjuna says, freedom thus depends upon yourself. No friend can help you to accomplish it. Work hard in learning concentration, discipline, and the 4 truths. Train yourself. Work hard in learning concentration, discipline, and in the 4 truths. Train yourself. So there's quite a few references here. These various, the 4 genuine restraints, the 4 close mindfulnesses, the 4 samadhis, and so on. These are all a part of what we call the 37 limbs of enlightenment. I'll leave that till later, but one thing I will return to next time and begin with next time is actually the way in which we construct self in 4 ways on the basis of the individual skandhas. This is what then constitutes the 20 wrong views. So actually we'll begin here next time just to get that point home, because that's really where it's quite helpful in terms of understanding what do we mean with no self and how is it understood. If we understand mind is empty of inherent nature, do we need to study the empty nature of form and skandha? Yes, we do, because this understanding sometimes is a little bit wobbly. If you have realization, then you don't need to. Then, if you have realization of the empty nature of mind, then of course, then you're realized. But until that takes place, we need to make use of the rational mind that understands this. That's where we can. Sometimes we would say, well, what is it? We would think, we say my house is, my house is, there's no, let's say my house is safe, but we actually need to, my house, I know I've fixed the roof, I've looked after my house, everything is fine. But then again, we need to maintain it and we need to sort of check. And that's where to have sort of a generally good, you could say, trust in the empty nature of mind is really good. But for us to actually sustain a confidence in this, that's where we need to actually also have a rational, hard, intelligent, that sort of undeniably we verified every nook and cranny, and you wake someone up in the morning and either question them or even see in their action whether they have this or not. So that's where it's very helpful to have this foundation. And I would like to implore you, because as someone who's been practicing for a long time and also had the job as an instructor, someone who helps a little bit instructing meditation, it's so sad to see very often how practitioners who have said, well, I don't want to study, or they feel uncomfortable with study and so on, And you can kind of say, of course, please, by all means, don't bother, do just practice. But you can see year after year, they still continue to have sufferings that they wouldn't have that suffering if they really had a deep conviction and in understanding, because that again would inform their meditation. Without this understanding of the empty nature of mind, you could say on the basis of hard reasoning, then it more becomes a sort of a state where we like to sort of go into a nice space where we feel good and like that. And that's nothing to do with what we're actually doing when it comes to cultivating vipassana wisdom. It has nothing to do with specific states. It has everything to do with insight into reality. So that's where we actually have to be listen to the Buddha and the masters of the lineage. We look at all the masters of the lineage, men and women, they all actually went through this studying and understanding rationally the empty nature of mind. Of course, when there is then great faith in this, and really a place where there's a deep sense of trust in the nature of this emptiness, then there is the possibility of blessing entering on the basis of devotion to a teacher. And that's where then this provides then the further basis for what we call co-emergent realizing, or insight and recognition of co-emergent wisdom. So that's where something really great can take place, but there has to be this initial place where we actually understand this thing that appears like a snake. There is actually no snake. Otherwise, we're always just going to be, our practice will be sort of, okay, I've learned to make friends with the snake. It's here, I can't do much about it, but it's there. Instead of actually just taking a look and saying, oh, there is no snake. And so that's where once that takes place, once there is that, not just sort of, I think I can imagine what it's like to be without a snake or something like that. There is a snake, but I'm sort of feeling comfortable with it not being a snake. Having that sort of intuition is going to provide a very weak foundation. So of course, you'll apologize. You might be a sublime being, in which case, then of course this doesn't apply. But I'm also saying this to myself and also to others, for the general audience here. Yeah. Do you have a reference for the 20 wrong views? I'll find some places and we'll look at it next time. Okay, thank you for enlightening the topic. Good, I'm glad if it's helpful. All right, so sorry we went a little bit over time. Let's see if there's, yeah. Okay, we'll conclude here. Thank you very much. Oh, as usual, I forgot the initial. There was somebody who said that they would remind me of these things. I don't know what happened. Anyway, the opening supplication will include that here now. The source of love and compassion for all beings, who knows all that is noble, emanation of Longchenpa, heir to a treasury of mind termas, skylight yogin of the vast expanse of luminosity, Jigme Lingpa, at your feet we pray. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. With this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. So thank you.